A plane was circling in the sky over Athens at an altitude of 10 kilometers. The aircraft had been out of contact with anyone for the past 2 hours. The controller tried 19 times, but every time there was only silence in response. The situation had become serious now. There were suspicions that the plane might have been hijacked. Without wasting any time, the Greek Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets into the air so they could check the plane's status. When the jets reached the aircraft and peeked inside through the windows, what they saw was absolutely chilling. The captain's seat in the cockpit was empty, and the co-pilot was slumped in his chair, completely unconscious. Inside the plane, the remaining passengers were either unconscious or perhaps already dead. The question arises, how did a normal flight suddenly turn into such a terrifying situation? Let's uncover the mysterious and tragic story of Helios Flight 522. On the night of August 13, 2005, a Boeing 737 aircraft took off from London's Heathrow Airport. The flight was named Olympia and was headed to Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. The aircraft was operated by Helios Airways, a low-cost airline from Cyprus. This airline flew passengers to different parts of Europe. The flight began normally, but a little while later, the flight crew heard a strange sound coming from near a door. Upon inspection, they saw that a layer of frost had formed around the door. This was recorded in the technical logbook so that engineers could check the issue after landing. At 1:25 a.m., the plane landed at Larnaca Airport. The pilot told ground engineer Alan Irwin to check the cabin's pressurization system. This system is essential for providing oxygen to passengers at high altitudes. Alan switched the control from auto to manual mode for inspection, as was standard practice. During the inspection, no issues were found. Everything seemed fine, but one major mistake occurred. The control was not switched back to auto mode after the check. A few hours later, the same flight was scheduled to take off again. Everything seemed ready, but with one overlooked mistake. Now let's talk about the day when everything was about to change, August 14, 2005. For everyone, it was just an ordinary day. At 3:15 a.m., Flight 522 was cleared for departure. This flight was going from Larnaca Airport in Cyprus to Prague via Athens. In the cockpit were 2 experienced pilots, 59-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten and 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Karalambis. Together, they had more than 23,000 hours of flight experience. The flight had a total of 115 passengers, including several young children and families. The team consisted of 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots, all set for this short morning flight. Everything seemed normal, but behind the scenes were details no one could have imagined. In fact, the past records of these 2 pilots were not particularly reassuring. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten had previously been fired from the British airline Jet2.com for repeatedly breaking safety rules and ignoring protocols. Yet, Helios Airways rehired him without a thorough background check. The first officer, Pampos, wasn't known for being very responsible either. He had a habit of rushing through tasks and had even complained several times about Captain Hans's carelessness. So the team already had question marks over it. By 5 a.m., the captain, first officer, and other crew members arrived at the airport to complete pre-flight preparations. But that day, some crew members suddenly fell ill, creating problems in filling the flight team. Eventually, 2 new flight attendants were called, Luisa Valtiera and Andreas Prodromou. Initially, Andreas wasn't willing to take duty on this flight, but when he learned that his girlfriend Luisa was assigned to it, he agreed without hesitation. He had no idea that this small decision would become the biggest turning point of his life in just a few hours. As passengers boarded the plane, both pilots in the cockpit began working on the standard pre-flight checklist. This checklist is an essential procedure before every flight, ensuring that every button, switch, and system is properly checked for a safe journey. But that morning, the flight was running a little late. In the rush, the captain and first officer started going through the checklist quickly. In this haste, a major mistake happened. They didn't notice that the cabin pressurization mode selector was still set to manual instead of auto. At 6:07 a.m., 10 minutes behind schedule, Flight 522 took off from Larnaca Airport. Everything seemed normal in the first few minutes. The weather was clear, and the plane climbed higher into the sky. For minutes after takeoff, ground control cleared the flight to climb to a cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. But now the real trouble had begun. As the aircraft kept descending, the cabin was not being pressurized. This meant the air inside was thinning, and the oxygen level was dropping rapidly. Just 5 minutes after takeoff, a strange alarm started sounding in the cockpit. It was the cabin altitude warning alarm, which triggers when oxygen levels drop to a dangerous point and masks must be worn immediately. But what surprised the pilots was that this alarm sounded when the flight was at cruising altitude. At such a height, this alarm shocked both pilots. They couldn't understand what was wrong. Everything started going downhill fast, and time was running out. Panic spread in the cockpit, and passengers inside were getting anxious. The crew tried to calm them down, but fear was clearly visible on their faces. In the cockpit, the pilots repeatedly tried to contact air traffic control. But within minutes, the plane lost connection with ATC completely. Now, the ground controllers had only one option: radio calls. They kept trying, but every time there was only silence. This was no longer an ordinary flight. It had become a ghost flight with an unknown destination. The plane was supposed to land at Athens airport at 10:45 a.m., but by 9:23 it was at 34,000 feet. At 9:37, it entered Athens airspace. Yet, there was no response from any pilot. Between 10:12 and 10:50, repeated radio calls were made, but the cockpit remained silent. In reality, both pilots had fallen victim to hypoxia, a dangerous medical condition where the body doesn't get enough oxygen. Its first effect is blurred vision, then confusion, slow brain function, and eventually loss of balance and altered behavior. Since the captain and first officer hadn't worn oxygen masks even at 15,000 feet, the lack of oxygen hit them hard and fast. By 10:45, the scheduled landing time, the biggest question was, where was the plane now? And the even scarier question, were the people on board still alive? When the last contact with Flight 522 was made, 16 minutes had passed, and the aircraft had entered Athens airspace. For the next 40 minutes, not only ATC but also several nearby aircraft tried to contact the plane repeatedly. But every time, there was only silence. More than 30 calls were made on different frequencies, all in vain. From the outside, the plane looked like it was flying normally, so ground control assumed the plane's radio system had a technical issue. But then something happened that raised even more suspicion. Flight 522 initially appeared to prepare for a normal landing. But suddenly, it turned and started heading back along its original route. This meant the plane was now in an automatic holding pattern, a path the system selects when a landing is missed. Seeing this, air traffic controllers on the ground realized something was seriously wrong. Meanwhile, thousands of feet above, inside the aircraft, something was happening that we may never fully understand. But one thing is certain. There was fear, panic, and helplessness in the air. The cabin crew sat in their seats, hoping the pilots would initiate an emergency descent to save everyone. But sadly, that never happened. The crew knew oxygen masks only provided a few minutes of air, and with every passing moment, their last hope was fading. Officials on the ground now knew something terrible had occurred. As soon as the disaster was suspected, 2 fast and powerful F-16 fighter jets were sent to intercept Flight 522. Within minutes, the jets reached the plane. One jet flew extremely close to see what was happening inside. When the fighter pilot looked carefully, he saw someone sitting in the co-pilot's seat, but their head was down as if unconscious. The captain was slumped in his seat, either unconscious or worse. The fighter jet pulled back slightly and tried to look through the rear windows. What the pilot saw sent chills down his spine. No one in the entire plane was moving. No one waved. No one looked out the window. There was only silence, as if everything inside the plane was frozen in time. Then, around 11:49 a.m., the fighter pilot saw a man slowly walking from the cabin toward the cockpit. Moments later, the man sat in the pilot's seat. The fighter pilot tried to signal him, asking about his condition. It seemed like the man wanted to say something, but perhaps due to lack of oxygen or exhaustion, he couldn't speak. Just 1 minute later, at 11:50, the left engine stopped working, and the aircraft tilted left and began descending rapidly. The man in the pilot's seat tried to control the plane, but it was probably too late. Music Flight 522 was now seconds away from doom. During this time, a faint, broken voice was heard over the cockpit radio, but unfortunately, the radio was on the wrong frequency. His final attempt to communicate went unheard, like speaking into a void. Later, when the voice recorder was recovered from the crash site, the world learned that this man fought till the very end. He never gave up hope, but fate wasn't on his side. Soon after, the other engine, the right one, also stopped. The man looked one last time at the F-16 pilots and slowly raised his hand, signaling downward, as if saying, "It's over." The plane plunged rapidly. On the ground, teams had no idea what was happening or what could be done. Silence surrounded everything. Moments later, the plane crashed into the hills near Grammatico, about 40 kilometers from Athens. Music. Just imagine that heartbreaking moment when the plane hit the mountains. The 121 innocent lives with no escape, and the fighter pilots who saw everything unfold before their eyes yet couldn't do a thing. That image was likely burned into their memories forever. The news spread like wildfire. Rescue operations began immediately, and bodies were recovered one by one. But when some bodies were autopsied, a shocking truth came to light. Most passengers and pilots had died even before the crash. This meant the plane flew for almost 2 hours without an active pilot. The biggest question now was, if the real pilots were dead, then who tried to control the plane for so long? The answer lies with the brave man we mentioned at the beginning, flight attendant Andreas Prodromou. Yes, Andreas, who fought till the last moment to control the flight. It was his faint voice that reached air traffic control, where he said "Mayday, Mayday" at least 5 times. Andreas held a UK commercial pilot's license, but he had no experience flying large and complex aircraft like the Boeing 737. Even so, he fought the situation and managed to steer the plane away from densely populated areas toward the mountains. About 15 months later, the Greek government released an investigation report stating that the root cause of this disaster was just one button, the pressurization mode selector, which should have been on auto but was mistakenly left on manual. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the oxygen inside the cabin kept decreasing, causing passengers to feel dizzy, heavy-headed, and short of breath. During this time, an alarm sounded in the cockpit, but the pilot assumed it was a minor technical issue. In reality, the alarm was a warning that oxygen in the cabin was running out. But by the time this was understood, it was too late. The government labeled it human error. The responsibility lay with the engineers who didn't switch the button back to auto after servicing, and didn't inform the pilots either. If that one button had been in the correct mode, those 121 people would likely be alive today. Helios Airways continued flying for some time after this tragedy, but in November 2006, due to heavy losses, the company shut down. In 2007, families of the deceased passengers sued Boeing for $738 million, alleging that having the same alarm sound for 2 different emergencies, loss of cabin pressure and takeoff configuration warning, was a major design flaw. The case was settled out of court. In 2008, 4 Helios executives were charged. In 2012, they were found guilty, but the others paid fines to avoid prison. Even today, there is widespread anger over this tragedy. Many believe full justice has never been delivered. At the crash site, a memorial stands to honor the 121 innocent lives lost because of a tiny mistake. That memorial is not just a place, it's a question that still lives in people's hearts.